How do you tell a story of resistance that invites others in? Dear listener, it's in the power of your metaphors. Something today's guest, Eiren Caffall, has truly mastered. Eiren is the author of two breathtaking books, The Mourner's Bestiary, a luminous memoir about inherited illness, climate, grief, and the stories we tell through the natural world, and All the Water in the World, a post-apocalyptic novel that dares to imagine what it means to protect knowledge, family, and hope when the waters rise. During today's conversation, we explore how chronic illness and a love for nature shaped Eiren's storytelling, what it means to write two books in tandem and release them just months apart, and how crafting metaphor-rich, layered narratives can become both an act of resistance and devotion. Writers, it's time to grab your pen, open your heart, and get ready to learn how collaboration can enhance your writing and how a single essay can become the hinge that holds an entire book together. Let's get started. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper Ellison, and I am excited to invite you to join me on March 5th for my course, Memoir Backstory. If you're a memoirist, you know that backstory is a crucial part of your memoir, but it can be so tricky to figure out how much to include and how to weave it in without overwhelming your story. In this webinar hosted by Jane Friedman, you'll discover what to keep, what to cut, and what to repurpose so that you can write a captivating story while also working on your author platform. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. To register, go to janefriedman.com/memoir backstory with Lisa Cooper Ellison or click on the link in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you on March 5th. Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper Ellison, and I am excited to invite you to join me on March 5th for my course, Memoir Backstory. If you're a memoirist, you know that backstory is a crucial part of your memoir, but it can be so tricky to figure out how much to include and how to weave it in without overwhelming your story. In this webinar, hosted by Jane Friedman, you'll discover what to keep, what to cut, and what to repurpose so that you can write a captivating story while also building your author platform. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. To register, go to janefriedman.com/memoir backstory with Lisa Cooper Ellison or click on the link in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you on March 5th. Well, hello, Eiren. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so excited to talk to you today.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. It's such an honor to be here. Thanks so much for asking me.
Well, I was seeing you all over social media. And then, of course, we have a shared friend, Amy. When that all came together, I was like, I definitely want to have you on the podcast. And then, of course, I fell in love with your writing. So I have a copy of The Mourner's Bestiary right here for anyone who is watching this on YouTube. And this book is such a work of genius. I just have to say that. Like, my head was spinning thinking about how you put this together. So I'm so excited to talk about that. But you are not just a memoirist. You are in the middle of what I would call double trouble. We have a memoir that just came out and a novel within 3 months of each other. Holy smoke.
Yeah, no, it's bananas. I do not recommend. When I found out that these books were going to be coming out so close together from two different houses with two separate PR teams, there was fear and trembling, which was appropriate, and calls to the few people that I know who'd done that. And most of them said, don't. And now I kind of understand why. It's a lot. It's a lot to switch between the two conversations. It's a lot to manage the two campaigns. And while it's great to be able to sell both books when I am out on the road, it also can mean very different kinds of audiences, but sort of approaches to each of the books, because I think we can talk about this. There's a lot that they have in common, lots of ways that
Yeah.
they pair, but there's also, one is a big post-apocalyptic adventure story, and one is a very thoughtful scientific memoir. So they're not naturally paired in people's minds. Yeah, it's been a ride.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. And I think that's probably a good place to start is to talk about the ride. But before we get there, I'd love for you to tell us a little about you and then also about the two books so that for those who have not yet read them, and by the way, listeners, if you haven't, you need to go buy them because Eiren's work is amazing. But tell us about your two books, your novel, All the Water in the World, and then also the Mourner's Bestiary.
Yeah. So a little bit about me is that I've always wanted to be a writer ever since I was 7. I think most of us that get into this game have that kind of epiphanal moment when we're kids where we're like, oh, there's a job that goes
Yeah.
these things that I get to read all the time. That's the one I want. And I've always written, but I've always written in multiple different kinds of genres. So I went my first year of college, I went to film school as a dramatic writer. I've written film scripts. When I got out of college with my shiny English degree with a concentration in creative writing, I immediately moved to Chicago where I started writing music and song lyrics and teaching creative writing in the public schools here, which is how I met Amy. We were co-teachers together, which was a million years ago, but also like very formative. I was a musician for 10 years and I didn't really write much in the way of long form at all, although it was still always percolating in the back of my head. And then right around when my son was born, I was asked by a collaborator from my life here in Chicago, who was a photographer, to write an essay as a sort of non-expert about climate issues in relation to the photography that he was doing, which was all these like beautiful large format landscapes. And because my mother was an EPA scientist, all of the things that had sort of woken up in me as a songwriter, where I was talking about nature, talking about the environment, but in a very oblique way, talking about my body in a very oblique way, kind of just came bursting out in this first essay. And I was like, oh, okay, good. This is the time to go back to long form. So I started writing journalism and essays around climate and environmental issues and the spiritual aspects of them. And then the idea for both of these books came fairly close together. I had the title for the Mourner's Bestiary far earlier than I began actually writing it. I want to say I was writing essays about parenting and spirituality and environmental collapse. And I thought this could possibly be a book someday. And I want to say that's at least a decade ago, maybe more like 15 years. Thought of the title and then kind of shelved it. And then about 13 years ago began writing the novel. So in a way, both of these books have sort of been percolating alongside of each other since then, where when I would finish a draft of the novel and knew it wasn't quite ready, I would go back to thinking about, okay, what would this memoir / essay collection look like? And worked on it over a course of a number of really fantastic residencies and fellowships, and eventually really came to the idea that I needed to write, if it was going to be a bestiary, I needed to write stories about individual animals. So The Mourner's Bestiary is a memoir of my family's genetic kidney disease and how growing up with that generational curse, which is what we called it, on the shores of an endangered ecosystem, how the stories of the environment and the body pair together in complicated and interesting ways, and how that legacy works both as the inheritor, as a child. So half of the memoir is about my childhood as a 9-year-old, kind of realizing for the first time that I might inherit what my father was dying of. And the other half is about me parenting a 9-year-old, realizing that I had inherited it and that I might be passing it on. And basically it's because the book works as a metaphor also for what we're all struggling with in terms of the generational trauma of living under climate collapse, right? We are passing it on generation to generation, trying to figure out how to explain the catastrophic nature of some of the situations we're finding ourselves in to the people who are coming after us. And so I knew that's what I wanted to write about. I began writing it, but it took me a really long time to find the form. All the Water in the World, at the same time that I was trying to, sort of occasionally think about this memoir, I was really compelled by my own fear as a parent of what the worst case scenario in climate change could possibly look like. And so when I couldn't sleep, I would get up and work on the novel. And the novel is a story told about a group of scientists and curators living on the roof of the American Museum of Natural History post glacial melt when the world is flooded. And they are desperately trying to hang on to the collections and the scientific knowledge that are part of that museum until a superstorm destroys the seawalls that have been protecting parts of the city, and they have to flee the city in a birch bark canoe and travel up the Hudson to try and find safety. So they both deal with really similar themes about water and protection and what we save and what generations owe to each other, but they're coming at it from different angles. And, as a person who's been writing music like this and films like this throughout the whole time, they all feel very much of a piece. It's the same basic question that keeps haunting me, which is like, what are we doing with this generational information, and how do we figure out how to have the resilience in our families and ourselves on the planet to be able to survive what's happening on a global scale?
Yeah. And what I noticed about these two works is that, when I was reading the interview with Amy Eaton that you did for Hippocampus Literary Magazine, thinking about the novel is about how people come together. And yet the memoir is really about that sense of isolation and feeling so alone. And so there's this beautiful conversation that they're having about the same topic of like, where do we fit? How do we belong? Where do we belong? And this concept of flooding, which you talk about so beautifully in the memoir, thinking about PKD and how that is a way that the body gets flooded, right, through these cysts. You are a master of metaphor. I just have to say that.
Thank you.
And so what's speaking to me in this work, and then I want to talk about how you're having these conversations out in the world as you manage launching two books, is that I'm a person who also comes from a family with a legacy of chronic illness.
Yeah.
So I am actually the fifth generation of women who ended up on the couch with weird autoimmune issues.
Wow. Yeah, that's a legacy.
And what I found for myself is that it's not just what happens to the body, it's the story around it. And sometimes it's the story of the silence, which is something that you talk about. So there's that angle. And then climate issues have been important to me for most of my life. I didn't have the scientific angle that you had, but I grew up in a Buddhist community where the environment was very important.
Yeah.
So I was learning about climate change. And, I met this man when I was 10 years old. I actually stayed in his house. I was getting ready to go to on some other trip. And I was a typical Gen X kid where, at least in my family, you'd get put on the Greyhound and you'd go places by yourself, right? This was like perfectly normal to do. And so I ended up at this like guy's house. Well, there was someone else there, this woman that I was staying in her room, but he had this almost fatal car accident, which woke him up to what was going on around climate change. And he cared so deeply about it. I mean, you had to compost everything in his house. Like, he was serious about this.
Wow.
And this is the 1980s.
That's intense.
But it made such a profound impact on me to really think about generationally, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And you confront this in such a beautiful way because you make us fall in love with the natural world.
Oh, thank you. That's high praise. I mean, and I think part of it is just that I was taught to be in love with the natural world by two people who grew up in these incredibly urban environments. My parents were hippies and they went back to the land, but the trick was neither of them had ever lived on the land ever. And they moved to rural Western Massachusetts up in the Berkshire Mountains, and both of them fell completely head over heels in love with the landscape in these really different ways that I don't think either of them really expected. And my father came to it through hunting and fishing and making community with other people who were interested in conservation of rivers and landscapes. And he really taught himself all of this naturalist lore that he passed down to me. And then my mother fell in love with geology when I was 10 and instantly understood the landscape in a completely different way, did work on pollution in her training. And then, her job for the EPA really revolved around, like, what do we do with the legacy of industrial manufacturing in the Northeast? And we were living in mill towns almost exclusively. So we got to see what that devastation looked like on the ground and what it looked like in the water. And so I had two people who were very passionate about making sure that I fell in love with the natural world. And that place that I get to go back to as a writer, where I am most at ease. I was a little girl who used to be allowed to go run around on the back mountain without supervision for hours and hours and hours every day. And I used to put my recorder that I was learning to play at school and like a couple of Tolkien books and a sandwich in my backpack and just go out and try to find bunnies in the garden and try to find a rock to perch on. And like that sense of falling in love with what was around me, so much so that, it turns into activism, storytelling, parenting choices, really was just, it was there with me from my childhood. And it woke up in so many ways. I mean, it wakes up every time I make art. It definitely woke up while I was making records, which if anybody goes back and listens to them, they're all about water and glaciers and explorers and feeling. But, when I was parenting and I was finding that I was starting to do this to pass it on to my kid, this love of the natural world, I started reading Rachel Carson, and I read her last book, which was published posthumously, which is basically kind of an instruction manual on how to raise kids to be alive to the natural world so that they don't get afraid of it. And it seems really important to me that in every book that I write, even if I'm writing about something really scary like sea level rise or eco collapse, or I'm starting to write a couple of books about fire right now, so I'm doing a ton of research about wildfire, and to be able to find a way into that story that doesn't push people back out again with fear for how uncontrollable things are, how much we don't have any power. If we can find a way to just keep that love affair going on and describe things in such a way that there's an entry point, whether you've ever been to that place, in the best case scenario, my book is going to go to people who will never go to Maine, right? And so I want that to be as alive on the page for them as the people that they'll never meet. I mean, writing about the dead is that same kind of preservation of like, I need you to fall in love with something you're never going to experience. And so, yeah, that was super important to get into the language to make sure that that was as important as the kind of urgent messaging that might be there, or the deep meditation on my own emotional landscape.
And you definitely do that without making it preachy. I mean, I felt like I fell in love with all of these different animals with that place. And then, of course, Dog Shit Beach. Okay. That is an amazing name for a beach. And it was such a beautiful place, and I wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah. I love that place so much. And Dogship Beach was the beach that we used to go to when I was a little kid, where my grandmother would rent a cottage, and we would sort of go down there for a couple of weeks in the summer, sometimes just for the weekends, and visit her. And it was the 70s and early, I think we stopped going there in 82, 81. The Clean Air and Water Act is almost my same age, right? It was 71, 72 that those things finally codified. And so I was going to the beach as a little kid when radial tires were still washing up on the shore, and there were still, huge blooms of algae and extirpation of the critters that lived in the water and collapsing of fisheries. And all of that was going on because of pollution that was unregulated to that point, or was just beginning to be regulated and healed. And yet that was the beach where every piece of sort of my natural history understanding of the ocean, everything was conveyed to me there. Every moment of picking up shells and identifying them, or seeing seabirds, or learning about horseshoe crabs, all of it happened in this very homely kind of environment that anybody, it's not a fancy beach. It's not a protected area. It's almost suburban in its way. I don't know. I think we talk about it as like, there's unspoiled nature, and that's how we're going to have our encounter,
right,
with falling in love with it. And then there's everything else where we've done all sorts of stuff to it. But I think that's a terrible way of talking about our world, and also a terrible way of cutting off the possibility of falling in love even with places that need healing. But
right,
that's a beach that needs healing. That's an ecosystem that needs healing, and that's capable of healing, as all places are, with a few exceptions. And I think when we start to reconfigure our sense of how thin the veil is between us and all of that complexity of the deep ocean, that liminal space of me on a slightly crappy beach full of people with cottages and, coming up on the train from the city, if you realize that the veil between that and the humpback whales is nothing, there's really no separation between those two places.
Yeah.
We can start to understand how to recontextualize what we think of as healing, what we think of as our relationship to the natural world.
Yeah, that's making me think of all of the things that you put in the book. And two images are coming to my mind as I think about how you wrote this, right? There's the animals, then there's your personal story. Sometimes it's blooming out into the science. It comes back to the story. It can come back to the animals. There's almost like a circular nature to how this works. That's like a swirl is an experience I had with this. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, it was so intricate and woven together. And yet, somebody could have taken me on this journey, and I would be thinking, where is this going? And how is this going to come together? But you have a payoff.
Yeah.
right? There's always a payoff in every single chapter. What did you do? How did you approach that? Like, what did you do? How did you
Well,
approach this?
I wrote the book like 7 times because I knew I wanted it to do that, right? There's this real gift of being a songwriter that I think I have to acknowledge right here, which is when you write a song, like I sing my own music, I write my own lyrics, I would write something in private and it would make sense. And then I would have the chance to arrange it and make it make sense with all sorts of dynamics, right? Somebody else brings in their genius and the dynamic changes and the lyrics respond differently to those dynamic changes. And then you perform it and you see what works in the room of a large audience, right? And then you record it. And then how that recording of that particular song meshes up against all the other things on the record album that you're
Yes.
trying to make. And you can change things in the room as you go collaboratively. You have a large number of people who are all sort of forming opinions about what you're doing. And you know, sonically, spiritually almost, when the tumblers all fall into place and you have something that works as a cohesive whole. To take a listener on an emotional arc, maybe they only listen to the song by itself. You should be able to let them do that, but also when they see the entire picture, it needs to work. And I think that when I came to crafting this book, and actually both books that I've written, it's a very similar process. I use those skill sets to be able to say, okay, there's one melody here, right? And here's another, and here's a third. And they need to be able to fit like that, like tumblers
Yes.
popping into place. And I need to keep moving them and thinking of them lightly as forms, almost musical forms, until they are resonating correctly with the thing that they're next to, right? So that if I am fascinated, and I am, by longfin inshore squid, and I happen to have seen them at a really seminal moment in my life, right? A moment of real rupture, old life, new life. And the squid happened to show up at that moment. But I don't know anything about them. The nice part of this process is that then I can remember that story and keep it. And then I can go through the research and find out what their story is, right? The squid has a story. I'm curious about it. I get to know it. And then I can see how that story fits in to something that I'm trying to cue the reader into emotionally. There's also a spiritual valence to the story of animals, which is why I chose a bestiary, right? Because that's how the church fathers taught natural history and religion at the same moment, was to present them with the scientific information that was available at the time, best science, but also to have the spiritual, metaphoric, complex, lyrical, poetic story, mythology pulled in, syncretic information all layered up into the entry on that animal. And I wanted my book to feel like that too. And what that meant was a ton of trial and error of structure, and trial and error of which animal goes with which part of what I'm trying to say, until I could feel it, like I could feel the vibration of it. And then all you have to do, once you've got those pieces, is just go through and scan for what takes you out, right? One of my writing group is this brilliant short story writer, Malia Dumbleton, whose work is brilliant. She doesn't have a book yet. She's got one in the works. Her work would blow your mind. She's in my writing group. She does the sort of classic, like, yellow highlighter for when she's being taken out of a piece, for when she's rushing through it with you. And going through the piece, the whole book, and thinking about that. Here's where it isn't working. Here's where I'm trying to go too heavy-handed with the metaphor. Here's where, but that metaphor now works over here. And then just scanning it. It took 6 years of very intense writing off and on to make it flow the way that it does. So one of the things I try to tell my students is, like, just don't be impatient with the story, because when you do find the form and it clicks, it's liberatory. Oh, I see it. I know how to put it into the right pieces, like you'd make any other art form, like you'd make a record, like you'd make a painting or a good piece of pottery. Like, you're like, oh, now it works.
I love how you describe this as a very collaborative process. So there's the original creation, there's how your personal story fits or juxtaposes with an animal story. There's thinking about what the reader's experience is, thinking about how things fit together. And so there's what happens on the page. There's the interaction between the page and your reader, and there's the interaction between the page and you
Yeah.
and your own intuitive knowing. It's all of it together.
Yeah.
And so I always ask people, because I think intuitive knowing is so important to this process. And yet it gets so dismissed
Yeah.
because we tend to live from the neck up.
Yeah.
most of us, because of how our society works.
Yeah.
And we've lost touch with what that is. So when you had that intuitive knowing, like, yes, this is it, what did it feel like in your body?
Oh, just joy. I mean, I think that's the thing is like there's that moment where you write a really great sentence and you're like, oh, like that didn't come from me. I feel like this huge amount of like this gift of just being open enough to channel something, some way that like that
Yes.
animal wants to be understood that I just happen to be the vehicle for right now. And I was raised by somebody who was very interested in utopian movements and the Shakers specifically. And they have this great phrase, hands to work and hearts to God, right? And I am a non-denominational person, but I consider myself to be very, very interested in spiritual questions. It's laced throughout the book. I had an agent tell me this was a stealth spiritual memoir. I'm like, is it really that stealthy? But you know, that moment of like being of best use for the story that wants to be told
Yes.
is what it feels like in the body. And I mean, I love this work because it's play, because it's the closest I get to kind of my childhood self. But I also love this work because when the tumblers all click into place and I can get out of the way of the ego, right? Your whole job is to get rid of the I, right? And the ego and
Yes.
the overarching like thought monkey that comes in and is like, this isn't right written correctly, or my editor isn't going to like that, right? That thought monkey goes away, and you have put in enough time and enough patience with yourself and enough faith in the work. There's just that sort of moment of like the meditators describe of like suddenly feeling like they're sitting in the palm of the Buddha, right? Like where it's just like, that's it. You've got it. And then there's a lot of work after that moment, because I don't want to say you have to chase that feeling, but I think there's a discernment process which requires an enormous amount of patience and faith that says, I haven't accomplished what I want to in the book yet. And I deserve more time, and the book deserves more time. We are bound up in capitalism. Capitalism is about productivity. Productivity is a huge part of the publishing world. And I think it can be really hard to be waiting for the book to sit into that space while people ask you, oh, you're still working on that memoir? You know, that's cool. How's it going? Right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We get these questions all the time. Yeah. And we're so conditioned to this idea of the capitalistic way. It's about products. And if you don't have a product, then your work doesn't have value.
Yeah.
Right. And so why are you continuing to do this? And so I work with writers all the time. I'm sure you do too, because you also teach writing, where we want to hurry up and get it done. And oh my gosh, I'm a writer myself. So of course I also want to get things done. How are you teaching the writers that you work with to have patience? Like, do you have an exercise, or what do you tell them that helps them do that work?
That's a really good question. I mean, right now, I don't really have an exercise that specifically does it, but I feel like I taught a really wonderful week-long retreat with Megan Steelstra for Story Studio last year. And one of the things that I loved about being together for a week was that we got to model the emotional and collaborative work of a community and enough personal resilience to take your time. That it wasn't about what we produced at the end of the week together. It was about inviting in the space and inviting in the deep work and the deep time that it takes to do this kind of thing. And I think the only other thing that I do is whenever I do a craft talk, what I'm trying to do in my public talks, both book events and public lectures, if it's anything that's around craft, when I'm guest lecturing, one of the things I want to say, especially to young writers, is that I want to tell them my story to model the complexities of choosing the writing life, especially around that question of productivity. I don't want to say gatekeeping, but there's a lot of mythologizing around like, well, yes, the book just came to me, or like I understood how to do it, or I took one really great craft course, but none of that is actually the way that it really works to make a book. It is about every conversation you have with other writers. It's about your writing group. It's about your spouse. It's about your family. Writers often want a formula for what to place their story into. And I'm a big fan of using things like Meander, Spiral, Explode, and native nonfiction to talk about how we actually can start to invent the structure that will work best for the story that we're telling if we take the time to do it. So describing like how many different versions of my book, there were different shapes of it even before I've settled on this shape where it's like, I talk about it as like kidneys or bivalves. There's a hinge, just like a clamshell opening, or the two kidneys joined by the central connector. And talking about how long that can take. this is a product that will live beyond you, hopefully.
Yes.
Even if it goes out of print, even if it's only in a few libraries, it is available to be found. Out of print books get discovered by people all the time. This is a message that someone will find years after you're gone. And so if you are looking at it as an ancestral project, you can take the part where you're afraid about time and put it to the side, where you're afraid about commerce and put it to the side. And we can be more genuine with each other as a writing community and say, it takes the time it takes. It takes the therapy it takes. I was a single mother making no money from my writing, my serious writing, for the entire time I was writing these books. You know, every time a writer, like Cheryl Strayed famously wrote that essay about how broke she was when Wild got published, you know, and I think every time a writer says that out loud in public, it normalizes it for my students. And I think we should be doing that more for the kids that we're teaching in colleges and universities, to be able to talk about those bigger questions of timing and finance, and how are you going to take those pressures off of the book to let the book become what it needs to become, and how to support yourself with those communities, with those people who are your go-to, who you can be real and open and genuine with, and not competitive. Like, I think, again, the arts can be so competitive, and one of the things I value most about the writing group that I'm part of is that they're all like deeply vulnerable with each other all the time. Like, we're always talking about where our failures are and our successes and what's painful about this. And I think that we need those models. And so what I strive to do as a teacher is really to try to put that out there, so that the conversations I'm having with my students send them back out into the world with a permission. Alyssa Altman talks about this too. She's got a new book literally called Permission, but with the permission to take the time that they need to take, to find the grace, to know that there's a huge complexity to doing this work, and there isn't a timeline except the one that's internal to you and to the work itself. And you got to trust it.
You do. And I think one of the exercises that I give to people a lot is a mantra exercise. And so I'll have them place their hand on their heart and say, I and my writing are on time.
Yes.
I and my writing are on time.
Yes.
And I think the more that we can say that and honor the fact that once these books are out in the world, they don't belong to us anymore, right? This time, which can feel endless, is precious. And once it's gone, it's gone. So you have all of the control right now. So enjoy it. And I actually wrote a piece for Jane Friedman on the importance of playing with structure, and how structuring your book in different ways can actually help you understand the structure for your book. You and I are going to have to geek out on all of this stuff at some other time, because I was like, oh my gosh, we are like so in alignment. And I love that. I love it when that happens.
Yeah.
But I think thinking about, like, don't put so much pressure on the work. Understand that it is perfectly fine for you to have a job, right? To have a job, period, and to have that job have nothing to do with writing. Sometimes that can be really freeing, because when you have a job that's about stories, then suddenly you can have a very different experience.
Yes.
When things become a product, or when you are dealing with other people's stories.
Yes.
So yeah, having that permission is so important, and being willing to just embrace the process. And so before I hit the record button, we were talking about trusting the process. And so I am becoming an Akashic Records reader. And so I do readings every morning, and I was doing a reading and asking the question, what should we talk about today? In addition to, like, you know, the questions I shared with you. And the response was algae blooms.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, yes, that is a part of the work. You know, it's part of what she wrote.
Yep.
But I don't know where this is going to take us. But let's talk about algae blooms, maybe how this relates to writing. And we're going to just see where it goes, because I think it can be really instructive to just do this live.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think, you know, when I think about algae blooms in relation to the Mourner Bestiary, I think about actually, this is really instructive to the work, because I actually think there were really two pivot points where I finally understood the book that I was writing. I mean, I had lots of pieces of it in lots of different forms for years and years and years. But I was terrified to write about my illness, because my family had been passing as not sick for, 4 generations at this point. You know, the patriarch would drop dead at under 50, and nobody would have known that he had been working sick for, a decade or more. And we didn't want to talk about it because of all of the lost possible opportunities and, the basic eugenics of American culture. So coming to the point where I felt like I could include that in the book was wrenching, and it was because I wrote an essay that I never intended to publish and talked about it with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker at dinner, and he was like, great, I think I want to make a film of that. Can I read it? And then went ahead and did it, and then it toured at film festivals as a short film for over a year, and I got to go and be in rooms with people who were like, for the first time, connecting with my story and the story of the environment in a live and activated way. And the emotions that were there for them were what I had been trying to get to without being honest about my own story. And the other branching point was that as I was really wrestling with structure and system, I had submitted what I thought was an essay, which was about algae blooms and red tides, to Guernica, like as a long shot. Like their window opened, I sent this draft. I didn't hear from them for over a year. I didn't assume it would ever be published. Still wrestling with the book. And one of the editors from Guernica wrote to me out of the clear blue sky while I'm wrestling and said, we love this. We'd like to use it. Is it still free? Yes. She teaches a class on this, and I think it's brilliant. I'm so glad she does. She started with my first draft. We did 7 drafts of that one essay, which is a really complex story about algae blooms, about pollution runoff, about nitrogen in the soil and in the water, about the history of red tides, which go back to pre-colonization in New England as something that was known about and worked with, but now have this potential to become out of control and poison shellfish, and that poison shellfish can poison humans. It's something that is understood on the coast. People fish and clam around it, but it's really got a different valence than when it started. And that required me doing research about the Clean Air and Water Act, the invention of dialysis, the invention of those two things at the same time, both by the Nixon administration, the history of how the biology of those blooming creatures is understood in the scientific literature, and also the history of my family in a new way that I had never done. And every time we got to a draft and she pushed me to find more or make those tumblers click into place better, I understood more what I was trying to do with the entirety of the book. I was like, every chapter has to do that. It has to do that. And every chapter that didn't do it got pulled out and reworked with this understanding that I had not had before. The gift of that editor's time. Like, that's an incredibly deep, generous process that she did with me that helped me not only understand my voice as a writer, or even just that essay, but the entirety of my work and how it sings properly together. It was like being in, a recording studio with a really great engineer where they're like, oh, okay, this is how we organize it. And you never hear yourself the same way after somebody gives you that gift.
Yes.
So there's the gift of the story, which I love. And I know people teach that essay, and I'm so proud of it still. And it's my 3rd chapter in the book, basically now. But there's also the gift of someone helping you refine your vision and giving you a master class on what your particular structure is a huge part of developing as a writer. And I think when those sorts of things happen, you just have to run with them, let go of any part where you're like, oh God, I had to go through that 7 times. I want her to teach other editors and writers how that happens. And she's taken every one of those iterations and been like, see, we got closer. Not there yet. We got closer. Because that's the nature of it. That's the nature of the work. We should all be so lucky to have that kind of deep attention and care put into helping us understand ourselves as artists in a new way.
Oh my gosh, I love that story. And I love this editor now. I mean, there are so many times, like I've had publications that it almost terrifies me when this happens, where you submit something, it gets accepted and there are no changes. And you're like, oh, like really? I mean, it's worked. But I think to have that level of care brought to your work, where someone is loving the story to the truth, is truly a gift. And I think as the writer, it can sometimes feel really frustrating.
Yeah.
Because people are like, but I want to get it done, or why are you making me do this again? But in the end, the payoff is so much greater. And the payoff for you was not just that you had this amazing essay that is now taught and that you're really proud of. It ended up being the linchpin that helped you understand your entire book.
The entire book. And all of the elements were there in the essay that I submitted a year and a half before, but they didn't do the thing. And it was that outside
Yeah.
eyes that really helped to change me. And it made every other editorial conversation I had after that easier, because I had a template of something that really, it bloomed my work in this incredible way. It's a huge gift. I mean, when I won the Whiting Award for this book, and I have to be clear because I didn't win the big Whiting. I won the for creative nonfiction writers, which is still big enough. But it was the same year that Guernica also got a Whiting Award. They give them out for nonfiction for publications as well. And I just kept saying that editor's name over and over again, which her first name is Eiren, and I'm forgetting her last one because I haven't said it in a while. But every single time that I was able to buttonhole somebody from the Whiting, I was like, I'm so glad that you're recognizing Guernica's editorial staff in this way, because life-changing.
And see, it all came from talking about algae blooms.
Yes.
He ended up being, the linchpin of your entire book. And I love that. And I also love how, trusting the process. We just trusted the process. Neither one of us knew where this was going to go, because we just said, hey, we're going to talk about algae blooms. And I don't know. But we ended up talking about how your entire book came together and how your book was a collaborative process. And once again, that teaches us something that's so foundational to the work that you do, and so foundational to just us as humans, is that we are all interconnected. And all of our experiences are interconnected. And the way I talk about spirituality, because it can be like the big S word, like people don't want to talk about it, but it's just how you make meaning from the world and where you find hope. Your books allow us to do both. We find hope in them as we explore these really deep topics, and we see how we are not separate from the world around us or from each other. And I just want to thank you so much for doing that for us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's the only work that I'm fitted to do, and I'm delighted to be able to do it.
Well, I would say that the universe chose well for you, because you do it incredibly well. And we could talk about this for the next 5 hours. I could totally see that.
Yes.
And yet we have to wrap up. So I'm going to wrap up with 2 questions. We didn't get a chance to talk about your book launch, so I may have to have you back to talk about that, because I think that is huge. And I think you're going to have insights, especially 6 months from now. You're going to know so much more, having gone through this with 2 books. And I can't wait to see what that is. But how are you taking care of yourself as a person with a chronic illness who has 2 books out? And, I've talked to people when they have 1 book out and they're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea how I'm going to do it. You've got 2. What are you doing? And everyone always tells me like, oh, I go out in nature, or I sleep, or these simple things which are important. So listeners, I'm not dismissing any of that, but I'm curious to know, what's the thing that you're doing that would surprise people?
I mean, I'm not sure it would be surprising, because it is sort of in that same category, but I've been seeing an acupuncturist to take care of my kidney disease since I was diagnosed, basically, like maybe 2 years after diagnosis. So we're talking 30 years of going to see an acupuncturist. And I had gotten it to the point where I was going once, maybe twice a month for maintenance care. It took a lot for me to recognize that I actually needed to go every week while I was doing book tour, and to try and make sure that I was scheduling all of my travel around that, because that kind of care for my body is the only way that I'm going to not get very sick, not get very fatigued, not have a number of other, co-emergent issues. And the other thing I'm trying to learn how to do is to recognize that I actually, as a person who's got some neurodivergences, I do not thrive if I'm not able to find really quiet spaces while I'm engaging in this work. So every time I'm going to a city for something, my instinct is to tell everybody that I know that I'm there, to make sure that I have dinner, that I have coffee. Like, that's the perk of book tour. But I can't actually operate like that. And I struggle with things like AWP or big conferences.
Yes.
Because I need an enormous amount of downtime and private time. Learning to recognize when I'm being emotionally flooded by the energy that's coming from people, because part of this is that I'm going and dealing with topics that people are really struggling with right now. And we were before this new administration. We are in free fall right now. And so, like, doing an event in LA 2 weeks after the Palisades fire, where the entire room was people who had to make a go bag in the last 2 weeks. One of the people at the book signing came up to me and said, I love your novel. I'm so excited. I've asked my wife to read it. She probably won't be able to. She lost her house. knowing that that amount of energy is coming in and that the amount of energy I'm going out is incredibly important to maintain means that I am spending much more time by myself, and I'm structuring my tour so that I can recognize that like there's a window when I have to shut it down. And it's been incredibly important in terms of just protecting what I'm able to offer, is recognizing what fills up my battery and what depletes it. Nature does a good job of that too, but I've had less time to be on the trail since I've been on the tour.
I would imagine so, but I love that you are thinking about your nature. And I would say that we are kindred spirits because I actually need a lot of alone time. And it's been surprising for me how much I actually need. And I'm getting more and more in touch with that because the outside world, especially when you go off and you do things, it's like the expectation is, yes, go, do, be with, and we have to be with ourselves. And so I love that you're doing that. Also, shout out to acupuncture. I have done tons of it. And when I was actively very sick with Lyme disease, I would go every week to the free acupuncture clinic to get acupuncture, and it was amazing. So I can't recommend it enough, and I'm so glad you do it.
Oh my God.
And there are so many, oh my gosh, yeah, so many things that we need, and nature teaches us. It cycles, all of the ways that it works. If we can pay attention to the natural world, which is another thing that I do a lot, it's instructive.
Yeah.
Right? It's teaching us what to do if we can pay attention to it.
I think that's completely true. And I think that, we don't really understand much about the energetics of life on planet Earth. There's starting to be really great studies about like how long a trail of the pheromones from a predator can be picked up by a prey animal after it moves through a forest. And, if there's a modality that you're curious about trying to restore you as you're trying to do this work and offer things to the world, especially offer the vulnerability of memoir to the world. If you wanted to try Reiki, or you were like, I think I really need to try chiropractic or acupuncture or whatever it is, the restoration of the body, the restoration of the spirit, when you put this much out into the world is real, and we ignore it at our peril, even if we're not chronically ill.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to pay attention to our energy, and we need to protect it and respect the energy of all things around us, not just humans, but all beings. And so one way that we can do that is by reading your work, because it is such a great reminder. So if people want to learn more about you, see where you are on your book tour, and most importantly, buy copies of the Mourner's Bestiary and All the Water in the World, what are the best ways for people to do that?
Best ways for people to do that is that I have a Substack, and I have a link tree in my Instagram that usually is pretty up to date about upcoming events. And both of those are usually pretty good ways to find out what I've been up to. I'm bad about promoting my events, so you kind of have to sleuth it out a little bit through my Substack.
Well, like how your book has a payoff, sleuthing you is also going to have a payoff, because people will get to see you and they will get to hear you read, and they will get to learn more about your work. And I invite everyone to do that. And I just want to thank you so much for being on the show today. It has been an absolute delight, and I look forward to having another conversation with you.
Me too. Thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute joy.
Thanks so much for listening. And thank you to Erin Loeb at Guernica for championing the essay that made the Mourner's Bestiary so successful. If you want to learn more about Erin, buy copies of her books, or read the essay that serves as the hinge for her memoir, be sure to check out the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I'd love it if you text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the answer to the following question. What's your favorite metaphor? I'd love to hear your thoughts on metaphors and how metaphors play a role in your writing. And speaking of your thoughts on the podcast, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Megan Justice and Michael Nortness for your insights into my conversation with Carolyn Fallert, Christina Ivasis for sharing how my episode with Lily Danziger led to new insights in your memoir, and to Catherine Phillips, who was inspired by my episode with Jane Friedman. It was so great to hear from all of you. And listeners, if you haven't contacted the show yet, I'd love to hear from you too. Until next time, remember that your story matters. And as you work on it, you change lives, especially your own. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.